Hey y'all, I'm Kim, host of Book Marketing Mania, and I'm so thrilled you're tuning in to learn how to build your audience and reach new readers on podcast. So we've talked the past few weeks about why podcast reviews are so important to podcasters and their listeners, how to leave a written review for other people's shows, where to find all your reviews and what to do with them. Now let's talk about how and when to ask for a podcast review and a couple of tips on what not to do. First off, let's talk about asking your listeners for a podcast review. A great time to ask for reviews is when you're launching your podcast. Your friends and family and followers will be super excited about your new venture, and they're going to want to listen and show their support in some way. And a podcast review is a great way for them to do that. So once your podcast trailer is live in the Apple Podcast directory, you can send the Apple link to your show to people and ask them to leave a review. Just a reminder, like we talked about in the last episode, 129, reviews are taking about 48 hours to appear live on your show. So think about that in your launch timing. If you'd like to get the trailer up, get some reviews live, and then be able to share those as social proof for your new show during your launch, you're going to want to time that out appropriately. So another good time to ask for reviews is when you're relaunching your show. Maybe you have a rebrand or you have new cover art. Your listeners are going to be excited about something new happening with your show, and it's a great time to ask for reviews. Or maybe you're coming back from a break. Maybe you took a long hiatus from your podcast and you're coming back with new episodes and you want to let people know you're excited to be back to serve them. They're going to be excited you're back. And that's a great time, again, to let your listeners and followers know you love their support, to show new listeners that there's new episodes now to tune into and it's worth their while to do so. I was so happy to get this review of my own show from Heather Edwards. Heather says, binge-worthy. If you are writing a book or creating a podcast, Kim has great content and information that will help you along the way. It's a great place to go for beginners or seasoned content professionals alike. Thanks, Heather. Hopefully you, as a listener, would see her review on my show page and think, this is the show for me that I need to tune into. And if you find value in tuning in, I would be so grateful if you too left a written review for Book Marketing Mania. Now, as you're airing episodes on your podcast, be sure to put in a call to action to leave reviews. Put it in your rotation. There may be other things you ask your listeners for. You might be asking them to join your email list. You might be promoting a special you have going on. You might be asking them to connect with you on social, but always make sure you have asking for podcast reviews in your rotation as well. Don't wait for your outro just in case they stop playing your episode before that. You could also ask for reviews in your dynamic content. If you use Buzzsprout as your podcast hosting provider, which is my favorite, you can add dynamic content to your episodes, which is like a self-sponsored ad where you could ask for a review, you could upload it to Buzzsprout, and you can say if you want to use it as a pre-roll right before your episode or a post-roll at the end of your episode. Then Buzzsprout adds that like magic to your whole back library. So no matter if a listener is just finding your show and they're starting with episode 1, or if they're at episode 100, they hear the same message of you asking for a podcast review. It's so cool. So another time to ask for podcast reviews is when you're celebrating a milestone or a holiday. You can offer up giveaways, and a review is your entry into the giveaway. Now, what's tricky here is you need an audience to share it with, right? To share about your giveaway, which of course is why I love podcasting, because it helps you build that audience. Again, dynamic content would be a great place to mention any giveaways you have when you have them going on. Now, let's talk about some don'ts when asking your listeners for reviews. Don't ask for reviews without telling them where to go, right? So tell them Apple Podcast or iTunes for written reviews and write it in your show notes too, making it super easy for them. Don't ask in a social media chatbot that goes out automatically when someone starts following you or your podcast. Ugh, that seems so slimy. I mean, if they've mentioned, I discovered you on your podcast, that'd be a great time. But don't just automatically assume anybody that follows you needs to leave you a podcast review. Now, let's talk about asking your guest for a podcast review. And I think of guests in two categories. One, those you pitch and ask to be on your show. And then two, those who pitch you first and ask to be your guest. Because I'm all about give, ask, like my friend Susan Mead, host of Encountering the Heart of God podcast, always says. So if you've asked somebody to be your guest on the show, you don't want to immediately follow up with a second ask for a podcast review without giving something to the guest first, right? So wait until their episode airs, share it, keep building a relationship. And if they're a podcast host themselves, I recommend leaving them a review first. And then you could reach out and let them know how your listeners and followers really enjoyed their episode and you were so appreciative of them taking the time to record with you. And then you could ask, would they be up for leaving a quick review of your show and let them know how it helps you and your listeners. Now, not every guest is going to do it by any means, but hopefully many of them will. Now, if your guest pitched you to be a guest on your show and they made the ask of you, I'd still wait until after the interview recorded or even aired to ask for a review if they haven't already left you one. That's also something you could put onto your guest form to ask if they've listened and reviewed the show, especially if you're getting cold pitches, but just make it be a yes or no. But don't make it a requirement for your guest unless it's, again, a cold pitch form that you just have on your website for cold pitches. I mean, if you've invited somebody to be on your show and then you send them this form to fill out and then you make them, leave a review, it's just too many asks of your guest, right? So keep in mind, if your guest is a traditionally published author using a PR firm, you may have to ask the PR firm instead for the podcast review since they're the ones that pitched you, not the author. So just keep that in mind. So another way to ask for reviews is to ask for swaps with other podcasters. These podcasters may be your own listeners or your past guests, or they may be hosts that serve a similar audience. So you could ask if you leave a review for their show, would they also leave one in return for yours? Now, I do want to caution here, make sure you're asking those who are your target audience and vice versa, so that your reviews are genuine and don't sound stale or cookie cutter, where you can tell the other person didn't really listen because we ain't got time for that, and neither do our listeners. And I have recently learned some lessons about that we're going to be talking about in a future episode about review swaps. So I often see people post in Facebook groups offering up swaps. And if you participate in those, again, be sure to provide the link to your show in Apple Podcast, not Spotify. Even if you host in Spotify, leave the link for your Apple Podcast app because it makes it so easy for another podcaster just to click the link, it pulls up, and they can add a review and listen to your show super fast. Oh boy, y'all. I know that's been a lot to cover about podcast reviews, and I hope it's been helpful to you to remember it is a part of your ongoing podcasting strategy, whether you're a host or a guest. And speaking of podcast guesting, over the next few weeks, you're going to be hearing about my experience with the Podmatch platform, where I've connected with some new friends who I can't wait for you to hear from. Thanks for tuning in today, and as always, I'll be there for you to help you build your audience and reach new readers one podcast at a time. See you then.